Queen Lucia by E. F. Benson. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 12. The miserable Lucia started a run of extreme bad luck about this time, of which the adventure or misadventure of the Guru seemed to be the prelude, or perhaps the news of her want of recognition of the August moon, which Georgie had so carefully saluted, may have arrived at that satellite by October, for she had simply cut the August moon. There was the fiasco about Olga coming to the tableau, which was the cause of her sending that very tart reply via Miss Lyall to Lady Ambermere's impertinence. And the very next morning Lady Ambermere, coming again into Riseholme, perhaps for that very purpose, had behaved to Lucia as Lucia had behaved to the moon, and cut her. That was irritating. But the counter-irritant to it had been that Lady Ambermere had then gone to Olga's and been told that she was not at home, although she was very audibly practising in her music-room at the time. Upon which Lady Ambermere had said "home" to her people, and got in with such unconcern of the material world that she sat down on Pug. Mrs. Quantock had heard both "home" and "Pug," and told the cut Lucia, who was 100 yards away, about it. She also told her about the engagement of Atkinson and Elizabeth, which was all she knew about events in those houses. On which Lucia, with a kind smile, had said, "Dear Daisy, what slaves some people are to their servants! I am sure Mrs. Weston and Colonel Boucher will be quite miserable, poor things. Now I must run home. How I wish I could stop and chat on the green." And she gave her silvery laugh, for she felt much better now that she knew Olga had said she was out to Lady Ambermere when she was so audibly in. Then came a second piece of bad luck. Lucia had not gone more than 100 yards past Georgie's house when he came out in a tremendous hurry. He rapidly measured the distance between himself and Lucia, and himself and Mrs. Quantock, and made a bee-line for Mrs. Quantock, since she was the nearest. Olga had just telephoned to him. "Good morning," he said breathlessly, determined to cap anything else she said. "Any news?" "Yes, indeed," she said. "Haven't you heard?" Georgie had one moment of heart sink. "What?" he said. "Atkinson and Eliz," she began. "Oh, that," said he scornfully. "And talking of them, of course, you've heard the rest, haven't you? Why, Mrs. Weston and Colonel Boucher are going to follow their example, unless they set it themselves and get married first." "No," said Mrs. Quantock in the loudest possible Riseholme voice of surprise. "Oh yes, I really knew it last night. I was dining at Old Place, and they were there. Olga and I both settled there would be something to talk in the morning. Shall we stroll on the green a few minutes?" Georgie had a lovely time. He hurried from person to person, leaving Mrs. Quantock to pick up a few further gleanings. Everyone was there except Lucia, and she, but for the accident of her being further off than Mrs. Quantock, would have been first to know. When this tour was finished, Georgie sat to enjoy the warm, comforting glow of envy that surrounded him. Nowadays the meeting place at the Green had insensibly transferred itself to just opposite Old Place, and it was extremely interesting to hear Olga practising as she always did in the morning. Interesting though it was, Riseholme had at first been a little disappointed about it, for everyone had thought that she would sing Brunhilde's part or Salome's part through every day, or some trifle of that kind. Instead she would perform an upward scale in gradual crescendo, and on the highest, most magnificent note would enunciate at the top of her voice "Yawning York." Then, starting soft again, she would descend in crescendo to a superb low note and enunciate "Love's Lilies Lonely." Then, after a dozen repetitions of this, she would start off with full voice and get softer and softer, until she just whispered that York was yawning, and do the same with "Love's Lilies." But you never could tell what she might not sing, and some mornings there would be long trills and leapings onto high notes, long notes and leaping on to trills, and occasionally she sang a real song. That was worth waiting for, and Georgie did not hesitate to let drop that she had sung 4 last night to his accompaniment. and hardly had he repeated that the third time when she appeared at her window, and before all Riseholme called out "Georgie!" with a trill at the end, like a bird shaking its wings, before all Riseholme. So in he went. Had Lucia known that, it would quite have wiped the guilt off Lady Ambermere's being refused admittance. In point of fact, it did wipe the guilt off when, about an hour afterwards, Georgie went to lunch, because he told her. And if there had been any guilt left about anywhere, that would have vanished too, when, in answer to some rather damaging remark she made about poor Daisy's interests in the love affairs of other people's servants, she learned that it was of the love affairs of their superiors that all Riseholme had been talking for at least an hour by now. Again there was ill luck about the tableau on Saturday, for in the Brunhilde scene Peppino in his agitation turned the lamp that was to be a sunrise completely out, and Brunhilde had to hail the midnight, or at any rate a very obscure twilight. Georgie, it is true, with wonderful presence of mind, turned on an electric light when he had finished playing, but it was more like a flash of lightning than a slow wonderful dawn. The tableaux were over well before 10:45, and though Lucia, in answer to the usual pressings, said she would see about doing them again, she felt that Mrs Weston and Colonel Boucher, who made their first public appearance as the happy pair, attracted more than their proper share of attention. The only consolation was that the romps that followed at poor Daisy's were a complete fiasco. It was in vain, too, at supper that she went from table to table and helped people to lobster, salad and champagne, and had not enough chairs, and generally imitated all that had apparently made Olga's party so supreme a success. But on this occasion the recipe for the dish and not the dish itself was served up, and the hunting of the slipper produced no exhilaration in the chase. But far more untoward events followed. Olga came back on the next Monday, and immediately after Lucia received a card for an evening at home with music in the bottom left-hand corner. It happened to be wet that afternoon, and seeing Olga's shut motor coming from the station with 4 men inside, she leapt to the conclusion that these were 4 musicians for the music. A second motor followed with luggage, and she quite distinctly saw the unmistakable shape of a cello against the window. After that no more guessing was necessary, for it was clear that poor Olga had hired the awful string quartet from Brinton that played in the lounge at the Royal Hotel after dinner. The Brinton string quartet. She had heard them once at a distance, and that was quite enough. Lucia shuddered as she thought of those doleful fiddlers. It was indeed strange that Olga, with all the opportunities she had had for hearing good music, should hire the Brinton string quartet, but after all, that was entirely of a piece with her views about the gramophone. Perhaps the gramophone would have its share in this musical evening. But she had said she would go. It would be very unkind to Olga to stop away now, for Olga must know by this time her passion for music. So she went. She sincerely hoped that she would not be conducted to the seat of honour and be obliged to say a few encouraging words to the string quartet afterwards. Once again she came rather late, for the music had begun. It had only just begun, for she recognized, who should recognize if not she, the early bars of a Beethoven quartet. She laid her hand on Peppino's arm. "Brinton Beethoven," she said limply. She slipped into a chair next Daisy Quantock, and sat in her well-known position when listening to music, with her head forward, her chin resting on her hand, and the far-away look in her eyes. Nothing, of course, could wholly take away the splendour of that glorious composition, and she was pleased that there was no applause between the movements, for she had rather expected that Olga would clap and interrupt the unity of it all. Occasionally, too, she was agreeably surprised by the Brinton string quartet. They seemed to have some inklings, though not many. Once she winced very much when a string broke. Olga, she was rather a restless hostess, came up to her when it was over. "So glad you could come," she said. "Aren't they divine?" Lucia gave her most indulgent smile. "Perfect music, glorious," she said, "and they really played it very creditably. But I am a little spoiled, you know, for the last time I heard that